Welcome back, fellas. Today we're going to be working on my Neo Geo AES. This is one of 5 consoles that I bought from Japan a couple of years ago, and out of those 5 consoles, 3 were faulty, which we repaired on the channel, and 2 were actually working. This is one of the ones that arrived working out of the box. It's got a 181K serial number, and this is a particular console that I'm preparing for sale. Now, I don't often sell my work. This is just a hobby. I do it for fun. But I will occasionally get rid of some surplus, and I already have a buyer lined up for this guy. So today we're going to be refurbishing this unit for him. We're going to be recapping the unit, doing the RGB bypass on it, and socketing the BIOS in preparation for a Universe BIOS install. I've already picked up everything I need to mod this console. We have a BIOS socket from Mouser, and everything else is from Console 5. This is the capacitor kit for the 3.6 revision motherboard. We have the RGB bypass kit, and we have some new rubber feet. If you're picking up a Neo Geo for the first time, you want to find out whether it takes 5 volts or 9 volts. Earlier revisions ran on 5 volts, and oftentimes the sticker on the back is not a reliable way to figure out which version you have. And on top of that, Neo Geos are notorious for being case swapped, so oftentimes the motherboard revision will not match the case that it might have shipped in. The power related components are in this area of the board, and you don't even have to open it up to figure out whether you have a 5 or 9 volt unit. If you just stick the back of your cell phone camera down the cartridge port, if you see a big coil over here, that means you have a 9 volt unit. If you don't see a coil, that means you have a 5 volt unit. It'll only take you an extra couple of minutes to check, and in fact, one of the 5 units that I picked up a couple years ago ended up being a 5 volt unit. So even though they are a lot less common, you never know. It's the luck of the draw, and you might end up getting a 5 volt unit. Now, I've already bought the capacitor kit for the 3.6 revision motherboard, and I actually haven't even opened this console up. So there's an easy way to figure out which motherboard revision you have by peeking down the cartridge port over onto the right. Let's try and get that on camera for you guys. I got a flashlight here, so we're going to peek down the cartridge door, and you guys should be able to see the numbers 3-6 on the far end of the motherboard there. So that's how you figure out which revision motherboard you have without opening the case. Let's get some video capture real quick, just make sure everything works before we start breaking stuff. All right, let's hit record. Turn this guy on. And I already know this console works. This is really just a test for the camera. Yeah, boy. All right. Let's clear the desk and open this guy up. This guy is getting new rubber feet, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove all 4, but if you were just trying to open yours up, you would just remove 1, 2, and 3. The hot air is set to 110 Celsius, that's a pretty low temp, and we don't risk melting any plastic. All right. Neo Geo feet have a way of disintegrating and just falling apart on you, so if you're working on one of these, just make sure you pick up a set of replacements. 5 screws to get inside. Let's flip this guy over. And top cover should slide right off. All right. Let's go ahead and take the motherboard screws out. Let's pop off the switches. 1 and 2. And out she comes. Okay, this motherboard's in beautiful condition. This is probably one of the cleanest ones that I've taken apart so far. These are the components I was referring to that make this a 9 volt motherboard. So you have a coil over here, you have a 5 volt voltage regulator, and you have a couple of diodes. All of these components would be absent on the 5 volt motherboard. This is the only chip I can see that has any sort of flux on it. It's very likely that was a factory repair. Would not have been unusual at all for these to be repaired on the assembly line. This is where SNK decided to put the on-off LED. So instead of having it adjacent to the power button where you can see it when the console's powered on, it's tucked in all the way in the back over here. The Sony CXA1145 RGB encoder, we were just looking at this last week inside the Sega Master System. And right next to it, we have the 3 filter caps for the RGB signals, 1, 2, and 3. So a little bit later when we recap the board, you'll actually see that I won't reinstall these 3 capacitors. And that's because the RGB bypass mod requires that we remove them. And what we accomplish by doing that is that we sever the link between the RGB encoder and the AV multi-out. So in essence, we're bypassing the RGB encoder. That's why it's called an RGB bypass mod. What I think I'd like to do first is socket the BIOS chip. I want to get that out of the way and give the system a quick test before I do any other work. This is a pretty sensitive area and arguably the hardest part of this project, so I just want to get it out of the way. Let's go ahead and wet these pads. All right, let's take a closer look here. Most of the solder is out, but I can still see a couple of pins like this guy right here that haven't fully cleared up. At this point, what I think I'd like to do is go back in with some hot air and finish extracting this chip. I set the hot air to 400 Celsius and I'm going to be supporting the chip from the other side with a pair of tweezers. I need to be very careful not to apply any downward pressure on the tweezers, otherwise it's going to rip a bunch of pads on the other side of the board. So it's just there for some support when the chip is ready to release. All right. It's finally cooled down to where I can grab it, and that looks like a clean extraction to me. Let's set this guy aside, and we have a little bit of cleanup to do before we install the socket. I think this side's all good. Here we still have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's try and get them from the other side. All right, I think we have about 5 that are still clogged up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 actually. This is what our final job looks like. And that's what it looks like on the back. Let's go ahead and grab the BIOS socket. There it is. And we'll go ahead and line up this notch over here with this notch on the board. And that slides right in. Perfect. Make sure it doesn't fall out. Let's mount the board back up and solder this guy in place. Let's take a closer look at our work here. I think that all those joints are looking really good. Let's go ahead and resocket the BIOS and give this guy another test. Record and turn this guy on. And it's working just fine. Cool. That's the scariest part of this project over. We've successfully socketed the BIOS, so now this guy's ready for a Universe BIOS install. Just pop the stock BIOS out and pop in a Universe BIOS. Anytime I'm doing a recap job, I'll often create my own capacitor diagram if I can't find a good one online. And The reason I do that is because I find that a little bit of prep work up front makes for a much more seamless and less frustrating recap. So I always recommend you make yourselves one of these. Sometimes the capacitor values can be all over the place. In this particular case, they're actually quite organized. So for example, this entire cluster over here, all these small capacitors are 10 microfarads and the negative side is on the right. That's not always the case, so you want to be careful to make sure you don't solder something in and put it in backwards. What I'd like to do before I start recapping is take a dry erase marker and just mark all the capacitor legs. That way I don't have to flip it back and forth while I'm working. We're done removing components from the board, and that was actually a bit of a pain in the butt, if I'm being honest. The result actually looks very clean, and we don't have any ripped traces, anything like that. But if we take a look at the other side of the board, these two over here got the worst of it, but thankfully they're both ground pads and they still have continuity, so we are good to go. The reason that happened is because this board has a lot of components with the legs folded all the way down to where they're almost parallel with the board. When you're using the desoldering gun, you're coming in at a very shallow angle, so there's a risk that you scrape the board trying to get it over the component leg. So just something to keep a lookout for if you're doing this work yourself. I should also mention that I've removed 5 resistors from the board. We have these 3 6.8 kilo ohm resistors right next to the multi-out. Those need to go in preparation for the RGB bypass. And down here, right next to the volume slider, I've removed 2 1 kilo ohm resistors. That's because we have to do some work on the audio circuit. The 3.6 actually has a lot of the audio issues that plagued the earlier boards resolved. It actually has a pretty good audio circuit, but hilariously, the left and right channel are swapped around. So right is left and left is right. And we'll be able to resolve that by rewiring these 2 1 kilo ohm resistors. Okay, let's get ready to recap this board. Let's go ahead and populate the board, being very mindful of the polarity. All right, let's do this. All right, let's go ahead and trim all the component legs. Before we clean up the board, let's go ahead and knock out the RGB bypass because we're going to be working on this area of the board. All right, so I have the RGB bypass kit here from Console 5. It's just 3 150 ohm resistors with some shrink tubing. And up on the screen here, I'm looking at the RGB bypass instructions for the 3.6 on retrorgb.com. So those are the instructions that I'm going to be following here today. Looking at the guide, I can see all the connection points, so I'm going to go ahead and pre-tin all those pads. Let's go ahead and solder these guys in place. That's looking fantastic. I'm really happy with how that turned out. The last step of this guide here is the C-Sync mod. Now, it is marked as optional, but apparently there's still a little bit of lingering noise from the onboard composite signal that bleeds into C-Sync. So by performing this simple mod, we can clean the rest of that up. I have a short piece of wire here and a 470 microfarad capacitor. We're going to go ahead and connect this wire to the positive end of this capacitor. Let's cut this guy down just a little bit. Pop this guy in the jaws over here. Tin this capacitor leg. A little bit of flux on the end there, and let's connect these together. Just a small amount of heat shrink tubing. So we're going to solder the negative end of the capacitor over here and then feed this wire to the other side of the board. Let's pop this guy in here. Let's flip the board over and solder this guy in place. Start off with the capacitor leg. Drop of flux. That concludes the RGB bypass mod. The final thing we need to do is resolve that left-right audio channel issue. Here I have the two 1 kilo ohm resistors that I removed from here and here. In order to fix SNK's mistake and flip the left and right audio channels, we're going to solder one resistor from here to here and the other one from here to here. The first thing we want to do is carefully straighten these legs out to get a little bit more length out of these resistors. And you want to get a little something like that. This part's proving a little tricky to show you guys on camera, so I might just have to show you the end result when I'm done. These 4 points are where we rework the audio lines, 1, 2, 3, 4. Show you guys the other side of the board. There's our audio lines, left to right, right to left. And of course you have to make sure these two resistors aren't touching. Might be hard to see on camera, but one of them's floating on top of the other, so they're not actually touching. I'm pretty much done here. There's nothing left to do but hook this guy up and test it out. I'm ready to test this guy. Now, with the modification we've done, we no longer have composite video, so I don't have a good way to get any video capture. So we have a state-of-the-art recording setup here. We've got the GoPro. We're using RGB SCART cables with the stereo audio adapter, and it's hooked up to the RetroTink 2X. If you guys look at the RetroTink test pattern, you'll notice some swirling. That's just an artifact of the way that I'm recording this. In person, it actually looks fantastic. All right, power this guy up. Amazing. I think I'm gonna end the video here, guys. There's really not much left to do other than close this guy up. I can button it up off camera, but the system's working flawlessly. The picture looks stunning. I mean, I don't think the camera's gonna do it justice, but it doesn't get much better than this gaming on original hardware. We're using quality cables with an upscaler on a system that's been recapped. It's had the RGB bypass done. It's got the left-right audio fix, and the BIOS has been socketed so that the buyer can install a universe BIOS if he chooses to. So that's all she wrote. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a blast working on this console. I love working on Neo Geos. Probably not the first system you want to buy into when you start retro collecting, but definitely worthwhile having in your collection. There's really nothing quite like it from this generation of consoles. Anyhow, I will see you guys again soon. Take care.